creating art is all about decision making, especially so for drawing illustrations. From the 5 years I've spent drawing art on the internet, I've made so many decisions to the point of honing them into a consistent process. Today, I'm gonna be showing you what my decisions are when I go about drawing a character portrait, to hopefully teach you guys exactly what your thought process should be like when drawing. Today's illustration is of the character Methode in Freerun Beyond Journey's End. Before we begin, I should talk about the references I used for this drawing. The references are this screenshot that I took from the anime, which was what inspired me to draw her today to begin with, her character sheet I got from the wiki, and my own photo I took of me posing. I'm not going to show the photo because I'd prefer to keep my identity a secret, but also because it's incredibly embarrassing. Just know that a lot of artists take their own reference photos to use when drawing as it's the most convenient. Now then, with all of that said, let's begin. Every drawing I make begins with a strong image in mind. All of my best work happens when I start with a great idea in my head. If I don't have anything going on up there, I usually look for a post on Pinterest, but the composition doesn't end up looking that great. So with that in mind, I begin to sketch with a gesture. When doing this, you should be thinking of the flow of the character over the accuracy of the drawing. Notice that I personally don't construct the body with basic shapes, apart from a circle for the head. At a certain skill level, I feel like you can just skip using things like boxes and spheres to construct the body, and go straight to drawing lines. Now, of course, constructing the body with basic shapes is still very important, and I definitely don't recommend skipping that part if you're a beginner. Heck, I feel like I'm not entirely skilled enough to do this, as you'll be seeing me fix up the shoulders later on. Anyways, by using the contour of her silhouette, I'm trying to create a dynamic feeling pose. Notice also how her head is facing one way and her body is facing another. By twisting sections of the body like the head, torso, and pelvis to face different directions helps with a sense of three-dimensionality that you otherwise don't get if they all face the same direction. Now I immediately move on to sketching the face, because having the face look good is what personally makes me happy. I feel like my drawings are made or broken based on if the face looks good or not. If I end a session of drawing with the face looking bad, or not having been drawn at all, I tend to skip the drawing entirely and don't ever come back to it. Here, I'm trying to draw as on model as possible to the anime. You might think then that I don't have my own art style of drawing faces. To that, I say that this is my art style. I believe that no matter how one tries to copy someone else's style, their own life experience, hardware, brushes, technical ability, and many other quirks of individuality stop them from copying 100%. Meaning, no matter how hard you try to copy, your own way of doing things will shine through in the end. Just because I copy from the anime doesn't mean I'm doing things one-to-one. You will notice how my own art style manifests as I go. Next, I draw the hair. Hair plays an important role in affecting a character's silhouette, so if you're drawing fan art and you want the character to look accurate, making the shape of the hair match their model is probably one of the most important things you can do, only below making the face look accurate, of course. Methode's long hair in this illustration also helps with the dynamic posing I talked about earlier. I mentioned earlier that I skipped constructing using basic shapes, which means now I have to fix the shoulders. Thankfully, with a lot of experience, I'm able to eyeball approximately how the shoulder should look. Now, for sketching hands, there's a fine line you have to tread between drawing it as realistically as possible, but also not making it look so realistic as it becomes all weird and fleshy. Anime hands are a lot more skinny and streamlined compared to normal hands, at least in my style, but make it too stylistic and now it just looks bad. Also, I typically don't draw fingernails on my characters as 1, they're hard to draw right, and 2, stylizing them often looks better. But I decided to draw them in this illustration, as they added some nice detail. Now I'm coloring the hair with solid gray. This is actually a really important step, as it helps me balance out the proportions of her hair. Well, why does coloring it help, you may ask? It helps because when you're drawing lines on a canvas, your brain can't help but see it as just that. But when you fill in the space, your brain goes, oh right, that's a 3-dimensional shape I'm supposed to be drawing. And now I can see that her hair is sticking out a little too much on the right side. So I fixed that. Now you may notice that my sketch looks bizarrely clean compared to other people's. That is due to the fact I use my line art brush to sketch. It's a lot like using a ballpoint pen to sketch in your sketchbook, as it forces you to draw really precise lines if you don't want to ruin what you're drawing. You may know artists who use very soft pencil brushes to sketch, or you may even do this yourself. I'd say using soft pencils definitely helps to create nice looking sketches, but when you do line art, it definitely makes your drawing look terrible. Having the same pen for both makes the transition much easier in my case, which is why I do what I do. Speaking of line art, I go right into lining the hair, which surprisingly is actually the only one I'm gonna do this entire piece. Everything else, I sketched clean enough to not need line art for. That's why sketching this clean is so important to me, as it saves so much time I'd otherwise spend having to do line art. After finishing the line art, I start filling in the flat colors with the paint bucket tool. Some artists find the paint bucket tool to be too annoying to use, and I felt that way too until I figured out the right settings to use. I highly recommend you copy and play around with the settings I use, as it's one of the most useful tools in Clip Studio Paint in my opinion. When I'm picking out flat colors, I try to be as accurate to the character sheet as possible. Of course, the shade of the color depends on so many different factors that I don't even grasp, like the background, mood, contrast, etc. Color theory is a bastard to learn, and even I don't have a great grasp on all of it. That's why I just stick to the character sheet as much as possible, as it's much easier that way. Color accuracy, on the other hand, is a whole other thing. You probably saw that I was adjusting the hue and saturation on Methode's coat earlier because I feel like it didn't match the character sheet correctly. Color picking in itself is a skill you have to learn, so good luck, because I'm also still learning. Now we begin the rendering portion. As you can see, I'm individually lining the hair strands on her hair. I sometimes do this as a very easy way to add detail to the hair. Most of the time, however, I just render the hair in big segments, separating the form shadow from the flats. But because the reference image of Methode drew individual strands, I decided it would look nice if I did too. Now we go on to the actual rendering. My style of shading is a blend of cell shading and thick painting. First, I block out the form shadows and cast shadows using a textured pen tool. Then I go over with a custom oil brush and the blur tool to blend, sculpt, and texture. The reason I work this way is that committing to the shadow shapes early forces me to think about form. Starting out with an oil brush would otherwise give me an excuse to be lazy with forms, which is how many people fall into the trap of pillow shading. Before I even add any shadows, I would have decided that the light source would be coming from the right side of our canvas, beside Methode. This means that any cast shadow would be placed behind to the left of any object in the frame. The form shadows of her face are drawn according to the planes of her face. The most prominent area you need to worry about for anime style faces is the area around their nasal bridges. Most artists you see online only ever really shade around this area. I'm not entirely sure why, but every artist I know does this, so it must be essential to the art style, I suppose. Now I'm working on her hands. Like I said before, hands are one of those things where the level of detail you commit to has to match the rest of the illustration. Too realistic and it clashes with the stylization everywhere else. Too simplified and it just looks lazy. Here I opted for a more realistic approach by drawing wrinkles on her folded hand, because otherwise it would look weirdly flat. Drawing hands is the bane of any artist's existence, and even in hindsight, I feel like it didn't make it 100% work. Also, I made the lines way too saturated and vibrant, so I had to redo everything. While blocking the form shadows on her coat, I have to keep in mind the way the folds work on her arms. Here, I completely eyeball them, as I trust that I kinda know how they work through experience. For any beginner watching this, I definitely recommend finding references for clothing folds from Pinterest and other artists on the internet. I won't lie though, looking at them now, I think the folds I drew look very basic and wonky, so I should probably study up on them. Next, to add a little more contrast to the drawing, I'm adding the ambient occlusion shadows to her coat. With ambient occlusion shadows, or 1.5 shadows as I think they're called in Japanese, you really have to use them sparingly, as adding too much and you throw off the balance of the painting. Think of them more like accent highlights, but for shading instead of highlighting. Speaking of highlighting, it's time to add some bounce light. I won't lie, I kinda did the bounce light a little half-assed on this piece. I did not really think the shape of it very thoroughly and just kinda slapped it on. I think it still looks decent despite that, but I recognize I could have put more thought into it. Frankly, I think bounce lighting is very optional because I personally don't do it very much. The times I do it, I like that it adds a little spice to the drawing. Now, I'm actually adding a highlight to her coat. As you can see, I'm kind of struggling with it a little bit, and if you look at the final piece, you can tell I actually went back and changed it because I wasn't satisfied with how it looked. Now we move on to rendering the hair, which is basically the exact same process as rendering the coat. First, I draw the forming cast shadows. Then I use a slightly different hue to add smaller form shadows with my oil paintbrush, which kind of doubles as texture for the hair. You may notice that I kind of render very sloppily, and that's true for every illustration I've ever drawn. You can tell I've honed my skills in the trenches of posting on Twitter, so I've formed habits way more on how the drawing looks at a glance rather than if you zoomed in. Because if you do zoom in, then you can definitely see that it's pretty sloppy. But most people don't notice that at all, which is why I probably won't stop. Next, what I like drawing on the faces of my characters are subtle makeup eye bags, as I find it to be pretty cute. To do them, all you have to do is draw a line with an oil paintbrush, then blend it out with the blur tool, kind of like makeup in real life. I find it gives a nice amount of detail to the face. Next up are her eyelashes, which on top of the sketch layer, I paint a highlight. This adds a bit of shine to her lashes. Then, as a personal style choice, I paint the corner of her eyelashes a dark red to sort of mimic eyeshadow. I copied this stylistic choice from an artist I love. I think their name was Odyssey08. They've since closed their Twitter account for some reason, which is really unfortunate, as they've been a really huge inspiration to my art over the years, and they're kinda just gone forever, which sucks. Moving on, I was a little torn on whether or not to add blush to her face. Adding blush makes a character cuter, so I usually do it to every girl character I draw, but Methode definitely has a more mature atmosphere to her, so I technically don't know if I should add blush. I ended up adding some anyway, but I made it a lot subtler than I usually do, because as you can see, I'm tweaking the hue and saturation a little bit. It ends up becoming a sort of mix of both worlds. Now on to the fun part, which is rendering the eye. I have a consistent process I use across every character. Base color first, accent colors on the bottom, which I blend up, shadows drawn on top, then pupils rendered on a separate layer. This specific process comes from me refining it over the years, copying a bunch of different artists, until I found what looked good for me. There's a lot more that goes into the process, so much so that I'd like to save it for its own video. So comment below if you want me to make a separate eye rendering tutorial. For the sclera, which are the white portions of the eyeball, you can see that it's not perfectly white, but rather a bluish gray. Shading the eyeball completely gray, or even yellow, can make the character look very sickly, so shading it slightly blue often ends up making it look whiter than if you just use pure white. Next, I shade her fur rough using the textured pen like always, doing it in small scratch-like patterns to mimic the texture of fur. By the way, if you want all the custom brushes I use in this illustration, I have them in a zip folder in the link in the description if you want to check it out. For the final major addition to this drawing, I add a bit of color to the cast shadow on the right, to make it a little bit more vibrant. Originally, I made the cast shadow a little too bright, so I decided to just make the entire thing darker. Oh, and it looks like I forgot to add a cast shadow that her pinky leaves on the face. I make the area right below the pinky a little darker to give off the appearance that it sinks in a bit where she touches it. And that just leaves off the final touches and the end of my art process. Overall, it took about 3 hours and 41 minutes to draw, which is slightly faster than what it takes for me normally. A lot of what I've covered today, I only scratched the surface of. Many of the topics I covered could probably be its own video. If there's something specific you want me to go deeper on, feel free to drop it in the comments below. With that, I hope you have a good day. Thank you.